Hey everybody, welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining us and thanks for registering for this webinar. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons that I'm excited to be putting this webinar on. I mean, there's of course being able to bring in sustainable and energy efficient improvements to a condo has massive impact. I mean, one building can affect so many different units, can build up to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. But the other side of that is it's a little bit more complicated to do than just, putting a heat pump in a single family home. There's a lot more decision makers that have to be brought into that scene. And that's another reason that I'm excited that we get to do this one with Sustainable Buildings Canada as our co-host, because they've been really locked into this program of figuring out how to cut through the politics, how to get the right information, whether it's financial information, feasibility information, what data do you need to get your decision makers excited about these common sense improvements to your home and being or to your condo and being able to frame those properly as well. And another reason I'm excited, and hopefully this will coalesce, is a lot of people that have registered and attending are people that are actively involved in decarbonizing their buildings. There's a lot of different advocates in the room right now. And something we love to do at Toronto Home Energy Network is connect these people at different stages, maybe people that are ahead or just starting off their journey, and hopefully sharing some information back and forth with people, right? And in that way, we can uh, I'm just going to meet some people here. And in that way, we can help each other out if we're at different stages there. So one thing I'm going to do is throw up a poll in a second. And if you want to participate in that, that's much appreciated. It just has some different questions about where you're at in your journey and maybe what's holding you back. So I'll throw that up right here. We'd appreciate any responses. We do ask about name and email. That's not so we can blast you with marketing stuff, but just because Zoom isn't so great at connecting names and emails. Sometimes people join with just iPhone or iPad. So if we want to get a follow-up to you, that's the reason that we're asking your name and email there. So again, really appreciate you guys joining us. And if you want to jump into the chat and just let us know what neighborhood you're calling in from or what you're excited about. If you're watching the World Cup, who you're cheering for. The Netherlands are playing later. My dad's side is Dutch, so I'm going to be staying up late for that game. So I'll be a little tired tomorrow, but that's okay. So it looks like we got who we got in the room right now. So again, the poll's pulled up there, so feel free to be answering that. And I'll jump into some of our housekeeping and introductions, and then we'll get right into the great content from Roya and myself as well. So doing the quick land acknowledgement, if anyone's been to one of my webinars before, we do the kind of standard, the retrospective land acknowledgement. And we also do a more contemporary, what can we do today to prioritize and practice reconciliation piece of land acknowledgement as well. So the first piece I want to talk about is, of course, the standard one. So we'll acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations in Toronto, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples as well. And Toronto's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people as well. And we're covered by Treaty 13. So that was signed by Mississaugas of the Credit, Williams Treaty, and multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands as well. So that's the standard one. And then some of you might recognize this artist already. It's an Indigenous artist named Philip Cote, or just Phil Cote. And if anyone's been down to Trillium Park along the waterfront, you'll recognize these big moccasin etchings that were done based on drawings of Philip Cote. And his work is all over Toronto. It's in schools. They even decorated bike lanes along Richmond with some of his art. They're in private residences. He's worked all over the city. So when I flip it over to Roya, I'll put some links in the chat to his website and his Instagram as well. So in this way, we don't always have to think about reconciliation as marching and protests. That's always important too, but also celebrating artists that are bringing the Indigenous worldview into Toronto through visual, through music. So today I wanted to show off Phil Cote to you guys. Sweet. So the agenda is fairly straightforward. We're going through the housekeeping piece now, and then I'm going to hand it over to Roy. He's going to talk about, future-proofing your condo and how the Sustainable Buildings Canada's Future Condo Boot Camp can fit into that picture. And so we're really excited to hear about that. And then I'll jump in after that. I'm going to go really into the weeds of a case study that the Atmospheric Fund did on a heat pump retrofit in Toronto, and they got the technical information, they got the cost information, they got the carbon reduction information. They really went deep on this. So I dove into that and pulled some things out for what I think people here are doing, which is advocating their board. Maybe not the ones designing and installing the systems, but there's still recommendations in there that are useful if you're doing advocacy. So those are the pieces I'm going to dive into. Then we'll have the Q&A at the end, and I'll stop the recording for that. And that's another way of me saying we are recording right now. And so hello to future viewers. We're going to be sending this to everyone who registered as well and hosting it on our YouTube page. And anytime I say a link, that's going to go in the chat. And if you're watching the recording, there's going to be a handout I link in the description there too. So you'll have that, and I'll send that handout out to everybody as well, including my slides. And if Roya wants to share her slides as well, we'll have that all linked in there so you can go through that on your own. With that, I'll introduce Roya, who is our guest speaker today. So Roya's really built a career at this intersection of housing, real estate, and sustainability, and is really a great advocate as well as bringing the business sense and the business experience there. So we can do this translating so sustainability becomes a common sense, the obvious next step to be doing with your building, rather than being, written off as some sort of like special interest that is just going to cost everybody money, and don't listen to them, they're crazy. So we're really excited that Roya could join us, and her work with Sustainable Buildings Canada is really pushing this envelope forward nationally. So we're really pumped about that. And then I'll jump in after. I work for Toronto Home Energy Network. So my job title, Homeowner Journey Coordinator, just means that I try to get people the information they need to unblock them as they're making their homes more sustainable and energy efficient, more comfortable, more healthy, whatever your motivation is. We mostly work with single family homes, but we're teaming up with Sustainable Building Canada today to talk about condos. So we're excited about that as well. And if you want in the chat to throw in a question as we're going, that's obviously totally fine. I'll be monitoring the chat while Roy is talking. Roy will keep an eye on the chat while I'm talking, and then we'll open it up and we can do unmutes and have a more open Q&A at the end there too. Great. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Then Roy, if you want to take over and get into your content, that would be awesome.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction, Nathan. Really
No
appreciate
problem.
it.
We are happy to have you here. Yes, thank you, sir.
You're good. You can see my slides now?
Yeah, it's looking good.
Okay, amazing. So, well, thank you again for having me and allowing Sustainable Buildings Canada to share our experience of working with condos to try and help them decarbonize and address climate risk. I thought I would give you a 2-second background on my experience. So I did for my sins. I studied mechanical engineering and I worked in the automotive industry very briefly. But I really wanted to work on issues that for me were like big, juicy problems in the world. And so I went to Sweden and I did a master's in sustainability there. I stayed and I was part of the teaching team for about a year and a half. And then I went to the UK, and that's where I really, really got the opportunity to dig into sustainability in the residential space. So I was there for about 4.5 years consulting. And when I came back, I've worked mainly in the residential space. I worked with a developer and property manager for about 10 years, then with another developer for about a year and a half, and then with an investor asset manager on residential rental buildings for a while. So I've really seen things from the business perspective. But this is also this work with condos is quite close to my heart because I actually live in a condo. So these issues are real for me as well. And so with that, we're going to go through a few things today. Um, there we go. So first, I'm going to make the link for you between condo buildings and greenhouse gas emissions, just so that you have a sense of the numbers. And then we'll also look at the impact of climate risk to buildings and the relationship there. We'll talk about the risks of not doing anything about addressing decarbonization as building equipment gets replaced. So this idea of, should equipment be replaced or building components be replaced as like for like? We'll talk about that a little bit. And then I'll go through a few examples of building changes that can be made that provide multiple benefits or co-benefits. And then we'll touch on some of the challenges that you alluded to specifically with condos. And I'll then provide a brief overview of the workshop that Sustainable Buildings Canada is providing. And I'll tell you a bit more about the organization as well. But first, I'm not going to convince you that emissions are, carbon emissions need to be addressed. I'm sure you're all here and you are fully aware of the challenges there. But I do want to give you some numbers related to specifically condominiums in Toronto. So overall, buildings in Toronto account for 56% of total emissions. And of buildings in Toronto, multi-unit residential buildings, that would include rental. So between rental and condos, um, that covers about 56% of buildings, or 56% of homes in Toronto are tall condo type buildings or residential rental buildings. And so the conservative estimate for the amount of emissions that condominiums specifically in Toronto contribute to is around 17%. And so really, if we're gonna take addressing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions seriously, we can't ignore condominiums. And so you might be wondering, well, where do the emissions from condos come from? And so it really comes from the energy that the building is using, both the natural gas and the electricity. It's really those two components. In typical buildings that are the majority of buildings in the city of Toronto, they're probably from the 60s and 70s era. The split between natural gas and electricity is around 65% natural gas and 35% electricity. So it's like two-thirds natural gas, one-third electricity. And natural gas does have a higher emissions factor. So per amount of energy of natural gas used, the emissions are slightly higher. And in Ontario in particular, we're fortunate because our electricity grid is quite clean. So the natural gas in our residential buildings is used to heat our spaces and for creating the hot water for our showers, our sinks, and our laundry. Whereas electricity is used to run things like lighting, provide cooling, run our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, the pumps, and then the appliances, our computers, our sound systems, that type of thing. So those two pieces are really what make up the emissions within the building. And so if we're going to start reducing emissions within buildings, those are the areas that we need to start looking at. And if it's natural gas that's the bulk of the emissions, then it's how do we bring down the amount of natural gas we're using for space heating and hot water? Um, but my next question is, do you know how to calculate the emissions intensity of your building? Emissions intensity is a very particular metric that's being used by cities, not just Toronto, but cities throughout Canada, North America, globally, to assess the performance of the building itself. It doesn't take away from the fact that the overall amount of emissions that the building is emitting is important, but it allows you to benchmark a little bit against other buildings. And it is actually a pretty simple calculation that you should be able to do with the help from your board and your condo manager. Effectively, you're taking your utility bills from your natural gas and electricity, and you're converting those utility bills into emissions for the year. So you'd need 12 months of bills. And you're dividing those emissions by the area of your building that's heated or cooled. Now, again, you'd probably need help from your condo manager or your board to pull those numbers together. The one tip I will give people here is that if your building is submetered, sometimes it's challenging for the board and the condo manager to get the full picture of electricity usage. For example, if every single condo has a Toronto Hydro bill, the board may not be getting the electricity use from the individual condo units. And so Toronto Hydro provides a great service. The board member or the condo manager needs to reach out to them, but they can actually give whole building information on electricity consumption without any of the units being listed. So it's anonymous whole building data, which allows the building to figure out its total emissions and its total emissions intensity. And so I thought I'd share some numbers. Now, this data, full disclosure, is a few years old. It's from 2021. But when we look at the mean value, so the most number of buildings in Toronto with a particular greenhouse gas emission, it's sort of the average. Most buildings, or the mean, is coming out to around 39 kilograms of carbon per square meter of building area. So just to give you a number to kind of, you know, where are buildings coming in for the most part? It does vary all the way from, I think, like 5 to in the 80s or 90s. Um, but interestingly, many cities are starting to set long-term carbon emission reduction targets for existing buildings. And so in the city of New York, their target by 2050 is 15 kilograms of carbon per square meter. And Seattle has a very ambitious target by 2050 to get to zero. Um, the City of Toronto has been working on an existing building emissions reduction target as well, and they expect it to be reviewed by council early in 2027. So this means that buildings in Toronto, even condos, need to be thinking about how to reduce their emissions. It's not something that can really be ignored. And alongside the the need to reduce carbon, um, buildings themselves are being exposed to a different type of climate right now. So, I didn't know this until I got into the industry, but when a building is designed, the level of insulation, the type of mechanical equipment that it is installed, is based on 30 years of historic climate data. And so your building has been designed looking at climate data 30 years in the past, 30 years before it was built. And we know that in the city of Toronto, we're going to be experiencing a number of different climate impacts as the total global temperature increases. We're going to be seeing, specifically in Toronto, it does vary by city, but we're expected to see hotter summers, more extreme rainfall, stronger storms, more frequent heat waves, and rising humidity. And so that's the climate that our building needs to be able to perform in the future. And this type of changing climate is something that our buildings are already being exposed to. And so we know that every single major building system is going to eventually need to be replaced. Whether it's the windows and exterior walls from window seals being degrading and leaking, which can lead to both air leakage and water leakage. The roof seals could degrade, and the roof could start to leak. And with that can often happen as well with the exposure that the roofs have to both the heat and cold cycles every single year. It can impact the level of the insulation over time. And mechanical systems do have a limited lifespan. So over time, they become less efficient, requiring more energy to run, or more costs to run due to continued repair. So equipment eventually always, both equipment and building systems, the exterior of the building, eventually need to be replaced. Even things like your thermostats and your sensors, computer programs that building managers use, like everything at some point needs to be replaced. And so it's not a question of whether investments are going to be made into the building for these replacements. The question then becomes whether those investments are actually helping to retain the long-term value of the building, which for all of us is often our largest asset, right? And so as really it's are those investments that are being made just replacing, the existing window that's there for the same type of window, or are we thinking about how we can use those investments to address decarbonization and future climate conditions in the buildings? So, um, some of you might have heard of this concept of like for like replacement, and there is a risk to that, which I've sort of alluded to. The traditional approach, which applies this like for like mentality, is a piece of equipment fails. There's no plan in place for what to do when that piece of equipment fails, and so it's replaced with a similar system, like for like, and you move on. Um, but but this type of approach can actually lock the building into, over time, higher operating costs. If you're not putting in more efficient systems and the cost of utilities increases, that can lock you into higher operating costs and higher emissions. Um, it can impact your ability to address future regulatory requirements, and especially on the climate risk side, if you're not beginning to address the climate risks that your buildings are going to be exposed to, that there's an insurance risk that we're hearing about down the line as well. And you may, if you're not thinking about these issues as you're retrofitting the first or second time, are you going to have to retrofit at an additional cost sooner than you actually would need to? So again, it's this idea that unless you have a solid plan for your building, over time, that like for like replacement, it can really contribute to the decline of the building performance overall, higher costs, and reduced competitiveness. Um, Sorry, my slides get stuck sometimes. And so I want to make the point here that condo law itself does not actually limit the condominium to like for like replacement. We're hearing there's a bit of a myth in the industry. Um, and so, the question becomes, if you do have to replace something, um, are you going to replace it with exactly what's there? Or can you find a way to use the reserve fund study that you have? I should backtrack. I'm going to explain reserve fund studies. So within condos, your building has a study that looks at each of the building components within the building, assessing the condition of that part of the building. So it could be your boilers, your windows, every single key element in the building, even down to the carpets that are in the common areas. Um, so it assesses the condition of those elements, the remaining time for them to be replaced, and the estimated replacement cost. And that reserve fund study is required to be done on a semi-regular basis. That's part of condo law. But you can actually use your reserve fund study to finance some improvements to those building components, meaning the example we've put here is that if your buildings are single glazed and they're going to need to be replaced within the next 10 years, do can you even put in single glazed windows? I think under code, because code has changed, you're actually allowed to improve the performance of those windows overall, to meet code. But we're asking the question here, or go beyond. So I do want to just provide the audience today with the actual language from the Condo Act in case that's helpful. And so I'm going to read it out. It does say that if the corporation has an obligation to repair the units or the common elements after damage, or to maintain them, and the condo carries out the obligation using materials, now this is the important part, that are as reasonably close in quality to the original as is appropriate in accordance with current construction standards, the work shall be deemed not to be in addition, an alteration, or an improvement, um, for the purposes of this section. So um, I'm flagging this because I want listeners to have access to the actual condo language and to kind of help dispel this idea that condos can only do replacement on a like for like basis. Where there is a significant increase in what the change is, and this is where it becomes challenging for condominiums to implement some of these larger investments needed for decarbonization and climate risk. There is a need for, again, depending on how big of an increase the costs are, there is a need for 2/3 of the unit owners to approve the change. So that is, again, that's one of the challenges that condos face. Um, and so here are some examples of what a future-ready replacement could look like. And so we've talked about this idea of if you go down the route of looking at your windows, do you replace old single glazed windows with new single glazed windows? Again, I don't even think that that's possible anymore under code. Or do you look at upgrading to higher performance double or triple glazed windows with better frames? And there are multiple benefits that this type of a replacement can offer. From lower heating and cooling costs, which is, an amazing point from the financial elements for the building. But in many cases, people that are living with single pane windows don't find it very comfortable to sit or sleep near the windows when it's really cold or when it's really hot. And so by putting in that improvement to the windows, there isn't just a financial benefit to the building. There's also greater comfort um, from the internal comfort conditions, so the temperatures that people will feel. Also, less outside noise. Often, better windows and better sealed windows, which comes down to how well the windows are installed. Um, yeah, you can reduce outdoor noise, and there also be prepared for the hotter summers that we're going to be experiencing. Another example is roof replacement. Many of you might not know that buildings do lose some of their energy through the roof if the roof isn't well insulated. And so when your roof insulation and your roof overall is coming up for replacement, are you going to put the same level of insulation in? Or are you going to look at increasing the amount of insulation within that roof? And for a flat roof, it's a pretty straightforward and lower cost change. Um, could you go so far as to look at installing supports and conduits for future solar panels, or adding a layer on top of the roof that acts as a cool roof, reflecting the heat from the sun? So these are all thoughtful considerations to be made in looking at roof replacement that can support decarbonization and address climate risk. And so again, it's this idea with this change of lower heating and cooling costs. It's a more comfortable top floor suite, better protection during extreme heat, and if you go for that solar ready roof, it makes it much simpler and less expensive to install solar panels if your building decides to do that at some point in the future. Garage waterproofing, do you just go in and repair the garage waterproofing in the exact same way that it has been done? Or do you go so far as to look at repairing the garage, improving the drainage, and installing something like a black backflow prevention, upgrading your flood prevention? Because those garages, if the building is exposed to flooding, you want to have that backflow prevention there. It's a tongue twister. Um, and so again, you're looking at elements that can address the repair that are needed, but but can go further to address some of the climate risk and decarbonization issues that need to be addressed as well. And one more, I know that you're going to get into the heat pump installation with the French Quarter specifically later on, Nathan. But the example here is, are you going to replace an aging natural gas heating system with another gas-based system, or look at equipment like a heat pump system? And I won't go into the details here because I know you're going to cover it. But this isn't to say that the heat pump installation is the first and only type of change that a building should be looking for. It really, all of this is to go back to the point about needing a plan. So really having a solid plan in place that's been thoughtfully laid out with the right people, so that when those changes are coming up for your building, you've already done the hard work of figuring out what it is that should be installed next. Um, Now, it's easy to say, oh yeah, your condo needs a plan. But there are challenges that condos face, and they're I want to communicate here that the challenges that condos face are normal and they're widely shared across many, many condos. So if you're experiencing any of these, you are not alone. You're not alone. From the knowledge that is needed on condo boards and with the condo manager, often people don't know what that they should be starting now rather than punting it down the road. And often they don't know where to start. There isn't sufficient data to understand the current performance of the building, which is which is needed to help make decisions on how to put that plan together. Often there's competing priorities in what those capital repairs should be. So how to spend that reserve fund. There are often competing priorities. There's fear of increasing fees. Um, there's a lot of different decision makers that have to make the decisions, and often with volunteer boards. And people have limited time and experience to address this. So these are all barriers that many condos are experiencing. Um, and I thought I would talk through some of the unique complexities within condos specifically. So beyond the barriers that I just went through, condos in particular. So if you look at commercial, industrial, or even residential rental buildings or institutional buildings, there are typically, for all of those other building types, there are organizations that have more clear decision-making structures, knowledge, and resources to effectively manage the value of their assets or their investments, including addressing decarbonization and reducing exposure to climate risk. There isn't that structure doesn't exist for condominiums. They're made up of board members who are generally volunteering their time, and many often don't have expertise in buildings at all. There's also a lot of turnover that can take place with who's on the board, so consistency is often a challenge, and people can move out, taking the knowledge of the condo overall with them. Um, and then questions like, do they have the confidence to make big financial decisions on behalf of the unit owners? Often with condos, we're asking a group of volunteers to make $1 million decisions, which is it's a big ask. And while the board members do have a close relationship with the condo managers to help them, um, the condo managers are dealing with a lot of different issues that they're trying to manage on a day in and day out basis. Also, not always experts on the technical side of what goes into decarbonizing and de-risking a building from the climate perspective. They do help to manage the condo budget well, and so it's really important that the condo managers and board members work really well as a team. The condo managers often rely on trusted advisors to help them in this decision-making process. Sometimes those trusted advisors are suppliers or installers. And if that's the case, they're often going to recommend what they know. They're not necessarily going to be thinking about best practice or looking to how to decarbonize and address climate risks. They may have that mindset, the mindset of repair and replace with like for like. Um, and consultants as well. Some have the knowledge needed to be thinking about decarbonization and climate risk, but not all. And so, how are the condo managers choosing the right consultants to work with? Um, and then we get into the context within which all of these people are operating. There's the regulators like the City of Toronto looking at how to manage the overall emissions of the building. There's the authorities like the Condominium Authority of Ontario who are trying to help make sure that the Condo Act in Ontario is being followed. So, the board members, the managers, the advisors are all working within that context. And then there's the unit owners who just want to see that their unit is being managed well. And in some cases, there's the unit renter. And so there's a lot of different people that are involved in making decisions for condos, which again just makes it an even more complicated space to work in. And so, while there are technical changes that need to be made, I think in the time that I've been in the industry, what I'm seeing is that a lot of the technical solutions exist to address reducing carbon and addressing climate risk. I think where there's more of a challenge today is around people and bringing the right people together, especially when we look at condos. And so there's a need for education, there's a need for communication and alignment and trust, and that really looking at that long-term planning perspective. And so we say the most successful buildings aren't necessarily the ones with the biggest budgets. It's about having an engaged team and really working towards a shared goal. And that's where, in this case, Sustainable Buildings Canada comes in. We are a 23-year-old not-for-profit organization with the vision to help be a catalyst to move the Canadian built environment towards being more sustainable. And we do that leveraging our vast network of subject matter experts. The range of people that we know is really part of our secret sauce. And we're trying to create and connect those communities of learners, practitioners, and leaders to provide platforms to collaborate and share real world, practical, sustainable solutions. We have a range of programs and initiatives that we run, and all of them are funded externally. So we are a funded organization to be able to deliver the work that we do. And one of the programs that we are being funded to deliver is the Better Condos Workshop. And I have to give a shout out to the Atmospheric Fund, TAF. They are our funder right now for this program. Um, and so this is what we are recommending, what I'm recommending today to help with getting your boards on board with future-proofing your condominium. Um, we're offering a free one day, it's a free, I have to say, free one-day workshop for condo board members, unit owners, and condo managers. You can also bring your trusted advisors with you to the workshop if you would like. There's no limit to the number of people from one building that can attend the workshop, but it's really about helping people to move from that repair and replace or like for like mindset um, to creating that long-term plan for your building and building that alignment amongst the key decision makers so that you can really start the planning process and have that map for your building over the long term, regardless of who's involved. Having that forward-looking map for your building is one way that you can be really thoughtful about how your reserve fund and how your investments are working best for the building. Um, uh, I'm gonna, I'll jump to the next slide. There's a few details I want to share with you here. So again, it's free. There's free coffee, tea, and lunch. We're in the process of figuring out what our fall dates are, so stay tuned. If you'd like to register, the scan code or the link can take you there. And the hook for some of the condo managers is that when they attend with a team, so either ideally, the condo managers are attending the workshop with a condo board member and a unit owner. Um, when they do that or bring at least one of those two people, they're eligible to achieve 5 of their 10 annual continuing education credits from CMRAO. So it's a big plus for condo managers. And so, what will you learn by attending? You'll hear directly from the City of Toronto on what their expectations are for buildings going into the future. There is a condo law expert who will stress the fiduciary risk to the condo board by not addressing decarbonization and climate risk, as well as a real estate expert that really understands the insurance risk side of things. We have a very well respected architect providing the basics of what is included in a better building and how the overall performance of the building will decline over time if that like for like replacement approach is maintained. Um, we have a panel of experts who have worked on delivering retrofits to decarbonize and address climate risk, and they share their experience with you. And it is an interactive workshop. So we have a number of activities that we ask the participants to go through, including asking that you bring your utility bills with you so that we can help you calculate what your greenhouse gas emissions intensity is. And we ask you to bring your reserve fund study with you. In addition, we provide resources that list the typical types of actions that can be taken at each stage of your decarbonization journey. And for those that have signed up and attended the webinar today, we're providing a part of that resource. You can get the whole resource by attending the workshop. Um, and we also have, which has been found to be really helpful, we also have our partners there. So City of Toronto, Toronto Hydro, the Atmospheric Fund, and the architectural firm BDP Quadrangle. We found it really helpful for them to be there to answer any questions that the participants have, the attendees have at the workshop. Toronto Hydro, I have to give a shout out to them. They've been able to provide the whole building electricity consumption for the year to people on the spot, which has been great, again, for calculating the greenhouse gas emissions intensity. So, as well, all of those partners are able to point each of the condos to resources that can help them develop their decarbonization plan. TAF speaks about their enhanced reserve fund study. Um, and I do recommend that condos check that out. And those that attend will leave having identified with their team the next 3 steps that your condo can be taking to start working on your plan to, again, decarbonize and get your condo climate ready. So, with that, I'm just going to do a recap on what we've talked about today. So, you need to have a plan for your building to decrease greenhouse gas emissions and address climate risk. Otherwise, your building will likely be stuck in a like for like replacement cycle, which over time will decrease the performance and value of your building, as well as increase cost and risk. The technologies already exist, but the biggest challenge is getting those decision makers aligned towards the shared vision and starting to create a plan for it. And we're offering this free Better Condos workshop to help your condo board get on board with future-proofing your building. So I'm going to stop there. My next slide does say questions, but I know that questions are going to be held until Nathan has given you the overview of the French Quarter
Yeah,
case study.
for sure. If you want to type in chat some questions, that's fine too. I'm sure Roy will keep an eye on that. But thank you so much for the presentation. I mean, one thing that you helped me point me to was the buildings being designed for the climate data 30 years ago. And I think that's especially top of mind now with all of the news articles coming out of the UK and Europe right now with the heat wave and understanding like what could be happening to buildings here if we get similar types of heat, right? And what that means. So I appreciate you talking both about carbon and climate risk. Both of those things are super important. So I really appreciate that. Thanks for getting into it. All right, I'm gonna jump over to my side and I'll keep it to 15 minutes so we're not keeping you too long and we can get into the um, part of the presentation where we're doing Q&A and opening it up and potentially connecting about starting a group around this. So the French Quarter condos case study is this great retrofit case study that the Atmospheric Fund was also involved in. The Atmospheric Fund also funds Toronto Home Energy Network. So they're a very active organization doing a lot of good stuff in Toronto and around Canada too. So we appreciate that. And they worked with this condo board who wanted to not do a like for like replacement of actually their chiller that was providing cooling in their building and wanted to get heat pumps instead. So they got a little grant to help with the cost, and TAF came in and hired a group to do a deep in the weeds study of cost, carbon, and everything like that. So I dove into that for us. Before I talk about the report, just the briefest slide on what we do as an organization, and I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end. But we're a nonprofit. We have nothing to sell you. We mostly work with single family homes, but again, we're talking about condos today, which is fun. And we want people to make the right choice for them. That's, their home, their budget, their values, their comfort, their health, whatever it is. We want to have those resources and connections to make that sustainable, energy efficient journey seamless, stress-free, easy, all that sort of stuff. So I'll get into our particular interventions later, but let's dive into this very descriptively named performance monitoring of, I'm not going to read the whole title. It's a very interesting, deep study, and it has many different types of audiences. It could be taken by advocates like we have today. It could be used by engineers and HVAC systems designers. There's a lot of different things in here. There's 45 graphs, 51 recommendations. So I'm sorry if you've already gone through it, but that's going to be my presentation today. I expect a lot of people haven't gone into the weeds of this one. And there's a lot of stuff in there for engineers, but when I went in there, I tried to put on the cap of like, okay, what's the information? What are the lessons that I could take home as an advocate if I was talking to a condo board, if I was talking to people that are a little skeptical about this, and surfacing those. Before diving into that, of course, what are we talking about? So the French Quarter condos are two buildings around Jarvis and Richmond. So if you've been downtown, you've probably been past these buildings before. They have a very distinctive style, so they really stand out. They were built in 2003 between the two buildings, 151 units. And the whole impetus for this case study, what really sparked it, was a piece of equipment died. It was actually their chiller that was providing cooling. Their chiller was natural gas powered, so they had a natural gas motor powering the compressor on their chiller and moving it through pipes in their home or pipes throughout the building, through radiators, in-floor heating, that sort of thing. And the board decided to buy a pair of new air to water heat pumps instead of the like for like gas system. So air to water heat pumps just means that the heat pump is taking the heat energy from the air, and rather than blowing it through ductwork, it's putting that heat energy into a liquid, whether it's a water or they had a glycol substitute in their system. And that is moving the heat and cold through the building rather than it blowing through the air. So that's all air to water means. They're very common in the UK and Europe, less common here, but they're a really good solution for older buildings, especially if they have in-floor heating and radiators. So that was the case with this building, so they went with air to water. And they did keep their existing gas boiler. It was a fairly new thing, and they had that as a backup. So their system is essentially a hybrid, but their priority was to use as much of the heat pumps as possible. They wanted to max out the heat pump's capacity and only turn on the gas boiler when it was absolutely necessary. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot view of what happened here. The study went from 2023 through 2024. So they had data from two winters and one summer in between there. So that's what they're drawing from there. And I'm going to cover the carbon savings and the operational costs and the upfront costs and all these different pieces. And as I was researching those pieces, this Great Toronto Star article popped up, so I needed to put these quotes in just to remind us like what we're trying to do here, right? Because the article points out through interviews that this project wasn't headed by a government or large corporation. As Roy was saying, that's not how condos work. It's groups of people, often volunteers, coming together, making this happen. I expect people in this webinar are in that spot as well. And they were desperate to decarbonize. And the second quote that I pulled is from the celebration they had when the heat pumps were actually installed. And so I want us to be in that mindset while we're going through all these lessons and recommendations, which can feel daunting, that this building was able to do it. And just picture yourself here, the lead engineers got a glass of champagne. He's like, if it wasn't all for you really putting in the time and effort, this wouldn't be here today. So that's what we got. That's what we're doing today. So let's keep that future-oriented mindset and celebrate the advocacy work we're doing. So the first thing I'm going to touch on is that main like decarbonization. So just reducing the amount of natural gas that was used in the building. So when they put in the heat pumps, what happened? So the boiler that they were using for space heating in the building, they reduced its use by 2/3. So that's almost 21,000 meters cubed of gas use per year, which is a significant amount of gas to be reducing. So that's fantastic. And the heat pumps were able to do 70% of the building's heating and all of the summer cooling. So they were really ramped up and working a lot, which is great. And the total tons of carbon that they reduced every year from operations is 31 tons of CO2. So that came from a 40-ton reduction in the gas And then, of course, there was new electricity demand from the heat pumps. Our grid isn't perfectly clean, so there was 9 tons of CO2 from that new electricity demand. So that comes out to 31 tons of carbon saved every year through this retrofit, which is really fantastic. But the interesting thing that I want to kind of poke into with this study, which dovetails well with Roy talking about creating a plan and thinking about this in advance and collaborating with lots of different experts, is this 31 tons of CO2 reduction was actually only about a 19% reduction in the total gas use in the whole building. That's very different from a single family home where when you install a heat pump, you're talking 60, maybe 80 to 80% of the building's gas use can be flipped with that heat pump retrofit. In this building, it was a lot less. So I am going to throw up one graph that I think was illustrative of this because it dovetails with, I think, the big recommendation on reducing gas that they came out with in this case study. So on the left side here, we have the baseline of the gas use in the French Quarter condos. You can see it's split between three different systems. So this was before they put the heat pumps in. And this teal one at the bottom is the district water heating. So DHW, that's what that stands for. So water heating was making up a significant amount. And then this orange one was a bit of a discovery for me. Uh, the biggest portion of their gas use was their make up air. So that's just important for large buildings to be circulating fresh air throughout the building because large ventilation fans are always pushing it out. And if you don't make up that air, there creates a lot of negative pressure. If you've ever been in a building and you're trying to open the front door and it feels like a wrestling match and then it flies open, that's what's happening. And make up air systems are bringing fresh air from outside to make sure that pressure isn't getting overwhelming. But if you bring in air from outside, it's probably not that perfect 21 degrees that you want in your unit. So you don't want to be bringing minus 10 air inside and just flushing it down the hallways. So there's a makeup air system that was bringing that air temperature up or bringing it down, depending on the season. And that was running on gas as well. So you can see with the heat pump retrofit, the boiler, when the right column is the actual after the heat pump retrofit, the boiler's gas use is down by 2/3, exactly like I said on the last slide, but it didn't impact the makeup air system or the district water heating, which comes to the first big recommendation on gas reduction is going in, exactly what Roya was saying too. Not to get too fixated on heat pumps is a great solution. Our organization talks about heat pumps a lot, but understanding all the sources of gas use in your building and then working backwards, which system's going to need to be replaced first and creating that very logical plan based on what's going on there. So that was the one of the big recommendations is understanding going in that depending on your building, heat pumps and space heating might not be as big a percentage of the gas use in your building as it would be in a single family home, but you have to go in and understand what that is for your building. So that's a good place to start for any building. A little tidbit they put in there, we noticed that that makeup air system, bringing fresh air in, was a lot of gas use. So what they talked about in the study is because they had everybody thinking about space heating and how to change it and how to tweak it, they were able to actually tweak the set point of that makeup air system to say, hey, our heat pumps are working really well. We can actually turn down how much gas we're using in our makeup air system and try to save some gas use that way, which wasn't them having to replace a bunch of equipment, but was tinkering with existing equipment and being able to find some gas reduction that way. Because you're already thinking about space heating, you're already kind of open that file. You might as well look to see if those other systems can be tweaked as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about maintenance and then move on to the operating costs as well as the upfront costs of the heat pump, and then a little bit about us, and we'll open up the Q&A after that. So maintenance, they didn't talk about the cost of maintenance, but there was a big flag with this one, which I think was something like the third or fourth recommendation in the report, which is that they wanted to make sure that people doing this in the future in their condos required signed maintenance checklists and to use manufacturer trained technicians when there's commissioning, when there's maintenance being done on their new heat pumps. So some of you might be reading between the lines. Why would they be so adamant about maintenance being so important? Well, I'll tell you the story. They installed the new heat pumps and then found that one of the heat pumps had lost all of its refrigerant because one of the joints in the heat pump came loose from a mooring. It was bouncing around and it developed a crack. You may know refrigerants have a very high CO2 equivalent. They're a very intense greenhouse gas. So if you're losing that, it's setting back the carbon savings that you're having in your building. And when they went to investigate what happened, the technicians said that they had checked all the systems. The manufacturer said you should check all these systems, but there was no signed list. The building didn't ask for one. So when it came down to accountability on how this crack happened and the refrigerant was gone, there was no one to pick up the pieces because no one had actually signed off on that. So I thought this was a good one where we can say thank you for the early adopters for going ahead and documenting their work so that we don't have to experience the same things in our buildings, right? So that required signed maintenance checklist is definitely that monitoring piece that can get ignored, but it is central and important. So the upfront costs. Now we get a nice photo of what the heat pumps actually look like, the stars of the show of this retrofit of this case study. So they installed, like I said, two air to water heat pumps, a 64 ton and a 51 ton unit. And that's one of those ambiguous HVAC terms. Again, ton doesn't mean that's how much it weighs. It means that's how powerful it is. Like horsepower in a car, the higher it goes, the more powerful it is. It's just one of those terms that's a little weird. So two large heat pump units on the roof. And the cost of installing these heat pumps was around $160,000 more than doing the like for like replacement of their existing chiller. So I expect some people will come up against similar situations. We experience that when we're talking to homeowners about heat pump retrofits. Heat pumps tend to cost a little bit more than buying a cheap gas furnace, right? But something they did that I appreciated in the report, and maybe this is standard practice with condos, but they broke that extra cost down as a per unit basis. So 151 units in the building, $160,000 more. That cost is spread out only $1,000 extra per unit. I bring that up because often when we say things are going to cost more, that can just get the alarm bells ringing on certain people. There can be a bias about this, and splitting it up across a per condo basis reminds people that this isn't a life-changing amount of money. It's not going to bankrupt anybody. They're not saddling the building with generations of debt by taking on this project, that it is a shoulderable cost. And in this case, they were committed to the environmental savings of switching, so they went for this upgrade. I'm not going to linger on upfront costs. That's just the reality of this equipment. But heat pumps also do more and are more efficient. You're getting a better product by investing in this. It's not just money thrown away. The ongoing costs, I'll split into the heating season and the cooling season because they looked at them separately. So across the two heating seasons that they measured, they did see the electricity bill or the total utility bill rise over the benchmark, but the rise was not enormous. It was up $6,700 on an annual utility bill of $186,000. So about a 3%, 3.5% increase. Again, not a mind-breaking or bank-breaking amount of an increase here, but their bills did slightly go up. If that starts to ring alarm bells for people, we often talk about how this is a 20-year system that you're investing in. And right now, electricity is slightly more expensive than natural gas. But given that in Ontario, we are exporters of electricity and we're importers of gas, the price of electricity should be more insulated from these geopolitical shocks like you have when Russia invades Ukraine or the US bombs Iran. So if you get hit with the fiduciary responsibility, just reminding people that gas has risk built into it as well when you're thinking about that 20-year timeline. But again, not a huge increase that was happening on this bill. And the thing that they pointed out in the study that I wanted to pass on to you, they had a hybrid where they could switch from heat pump to gas. If you're in that same situation, it can be good to point out that you have control over what utility and which fuel you're using at the time. So if it's impossible to do the full heat pump utilization, you can take a step back and say, okay, when we can use gas to balance out those costs. But again, the costs are not extreme in this case. Same for the summer. There was the last piece there was just using the heat pumps off peak hours or something they recommended as well. The summer cooling bill also went up slightly. That was something they spent some time talking about because often people talk about heat pumps being much more efficient, so necessarily the costs would come down. This just, again, comes back to that situation where electricity is just a little bit more expensive than gas right now. But they did say small savings are possible with a different configuration of the system, but I want to couch this in again, this is an air to water system. So there are some inefficiencies that happen when you're transferring heat into a liquid. And the situation might be very different if you're in a building where it's air to air and you have ductwork going through the building. So you might see some savings on summer cooling if you're in that situation, but an air to water is a little bit different. So my last slide before I talk about what we're doing and we open up the Q&A here is, like Roya was saying, consider the whole building and all of the pieces that fit together when you're doing this decarbonization. And this pulls right from the report. Combine the heat pump retrofit with other energy upgrades. Roya did a great job talking about all those different things, air sealing and insulation and how they fit in. This is a good lever actually because you can have these improvements pay for themselves over time. So you can have a cost positive argument there, which is great. And then the last one, this one's for me. This one actually wasn't in the report, but I'm learning in my work talking about heat pumps and sustainability retrofits and from mentors as well that if you have an argument that you can make about improving health and human well-being, that can be a fantastic argument to lead with because environmentalism can be written off as a special outside case by some people, obviously not the people in this room, but human health and well-being in the building is an absolutely universal thing that people need to care about. It's a lot harder to say no to something that's going to reduce the amount of VOCs in the building or have a better envelope so wildfire smoke won't penetrate into units. If you can find these health arguments, they can really carry the heat pump retrofit. So I'll just spend 2 minutes talking about what we're doing. And as I'm talking about it, I'm going to throw up a quick poll here. Again, a lot of what we do uh, at Toronto Home Energy Network is get people together that have already gone ahead on their heat pump journey and share those speed bumps and learnings and connections with other people in Toronto. So we have these neighborhood groups across the city that we call partner communities. They cover the East End, the West End, Central, and a bit uptown too. And basically, these groups just hold parties. We do heat pump parties. They're a lot of fun. People who have heat pumps invite their neighbors over. Yeah, this is how much it costs. This is who I used. I didn't freeze my butt off in the winter. No, it looks just like this. It's a real thing. And these actually are incredibly useful at demystifying the process, and people open up and really ask pointed questions about their building and their real blockers come out and we can acknowledge them there. So they're really useful. So what I threw up in the poll there, and if you're watching the recording, there will be a link to this in the handout and the description as well, is we have one of our board members that does a lot of this kind of community building work around condo retrofits as well. So if you think you and your building would benefit from that sort of group, definitely throw your name and email in there and we'll see if we can get something together that connects with the online support that we do. We have a group called the Home Retrofit Forum on Facebook where people can just ask candid questions and have people with firsthand electrification experience answer them. And we're really proud of our first heat pump guidebook, which just tackles all those questions. So if you got, friends and family in single family homes, this is a really great resource to send them if they start asking you about heat pumps. So that'll say thank you, especially to our funders and to Roya and Sustainable Building Canada for joining us today. It was a lot of fun. And for all of you guys for taking some time out of your evening and joining us. So if people want to put their hands up in chat or talk about any questions or ask them now, I'm going to stop the recording of the